Hi, I'm Gary Berman, host of the Unsung Cyberhero Adventures podcast. Our mission is to shine a light on the unsung heroes who keep us safe online while at work, home, and school. I'm the least likely person to be interviewing some of the world's top people in the cybersecurity community and beyond, including thought leaders from large enterprises, small and medium businesses, vendors, law enforcement, the government, academia, and others within the goal of humanizing cybercrime. Why? Well, here's my origin story. I started a marketing research and consulting company, and after 10 years, I was able to sell 49% to a global organization. Things were going great. Then it happened right under my nose. A trusted insider and tech contractor essentially cloned my company. They spoofed my website, redirected incoming calls to their company, and even pretended to be whistleblowers by calling my biggest clients and saying there was fraud in my data collection operations and that I was under investigation by the FBI and to stop all communications. Well, after a long battle, I lost everything. And it wasn't only my loss. I had to lay off all my other great people and close the company. To make a long story short, I was unable to receive justice due to the difficulty of attribution. Well, as time passed, I learned that being a victim was just exhausting and unfortunately not very unique. So I decided that I needed to pivot from victim to advocate and turn my experience into something that would help keep other people safe while online. What next? I needed a crash course on the basis of cybersecurity, so naturally I ordered a copy of Cybersecurity for Dummies. And after only 10 pages, I was lost. That's when I realized there had to be a better way to distill complicated cybersecurity and tech information into something that all business people and their families would understand and enjoy. Not only those people in tech and cybersecurity. Well, after watching Spider-Man at the movies, that's when it hit me, superhero comics. My goal was to convert blinded, real-life stories of cybercrime into fun, engaging, empowering, and informative superhero comics and animations. The Cyberhero Adventures, Defenders of the Digital Universe was born. Having decided on the medium of superhero comics, where was I going to get the stories? Conferences! It turns out that there are hundreds of cybersecurity conferences, so I began to attend every conference that I could, and that's where I met today's guest, Sam Visner. Hey, Sam.
How are you doing, Gary? Thanks for having me on board.
What a privilege. Tell us your origin story.
Well, everybody comes from somewhere, and if you'll let me, I'm going to start my origin story with an artifact. It'll be a little difficult for people to see it, but I guess I would have to say that public service and service to the country's national security is sort of in my blood. I'm going to show you something that I doubt many of your viewers or readers will have seen, and it's going to be pretty difficult to read. I'm going to show it to you, both the front and then the back.
Yeah.
Let me read it for you. It says Columbia University, World War II, for participation in the work of the Division of War Research.
Wow.
And it has my father's name, Sidney Visner. My father was a nuclear physicist, and he and my mother found themselves in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of the principal sites of the Manhattan Project during the Second World War. The Manhattan Project, of course, known more formally as the Manhattan District, was the nation's successful effort to develop nuclear weapons, which I think, as you know, were used successfully in ending the Second World War and in our defeat of Japan. My father and mother stayed in Oak Ridge after the war, and my late brother and I were born there. My folks moved first back to New York, which is where they were from, and then to Connecticut. My father worked both in commercial nuclear power and also did work for the early nuclear navy and designed the reactor for one of our earliest nuclear submarines. So from a very early age, the idea of working, even if in the private sector, in support of something important to the nation's security was something that to me was natural in the family. Growing up, I grew up with a father who was a physicist and a brother who ultimately became an MD. I had a strong interest in science, but I also developed a strong interest in politics. My father would bring home He'd bring home the Sunday New York Times and encourage me to read that. So you learn about politics and policy and current events, and also Scientific American and Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. So it was never clear what I would do. And all through school, when I took it, I took a degree in international politics from Georgetown, which is where I teach today as an adjunct professor of cybersecurity, policy operations, and technology. I was interested on the one hand in international relations and foreign policy and national security, but technology and the evolution of telecommunications and computer science on the other. So even in the 1970s and 1980s, my career and my life represented a strong intersection of those two. And when I went ultimately into the government, I found that I was not as interested in political analysis initially as I was in how technology could be used to help to help collect and create useful intelligence for the nation's decision makers. And as the business of signals intelligence again began to blossom, that is extracting information from foreign signals, I said, well, this is a great way to combine my interest in international affairs and national security with technology. And I've always tried to operate at that interesting intersection of technology and national security policy. And now in the year 2020, I'd have to say that finally, I think there's a recognition that the two of them have become intertwined and absolutely inextricable. So throughout my career as a young intelligence officer, as a program manager in the private sector, as a senior executive in the back in the government at the National Security Agency, where I was chief of signals intelligence programs, and then running cybersecurity businesses, I've always operated at that intersection of policy, business, and technology, overshadowed always by the concept of service to the nation.
Wow. I mean, thank you so much for your service, for your family, and everything that that you've done and will do for our country. It's very interesting you bring up a point about kind of this new theater of war. I mean, you have a kinetic, war, and a lot of people, use the term, cyber war. What's your view of that? I mean, how would you characterize the state of things, and what's keeping you up at night, regarding the current state of cybersecurity?
Well, it's a big question, Gary, and let me answer it in a few pieces. First, there is a famous phrase that is attributed to a Chinese leader, now gone, Deng Xiaoping, who was asked, some 170, 180 years after it had happened, his opinion of the French Revolution. And he is reported to have said, it's too soon to tell. In some ways, the concept of cyber war, cyber in warfare, where this is and where this is going, I would say it may be too soon to tell, but I'll make some observations. So first, the idea that we will use the electromagnetic world of where we send and process information as an adjunct to warfare, to command our troops, to move things around, that's not new. The North during the US Civil War used the telegraph to decisive advantage in being able to mobilize and to manage troops and manage battles hundreds of miles away from Washington, D.C. See the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, where they're waiting for the results of the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can see telegraph operators side by side in their little operational carols. It's a very contemporary image. But it's only since the 1950s and 1960s, when we built the thing called cyberspace, that we started to think about cyberspace as a domain in which warfare could really take place. The late 50s and early 60s saw the creation of something called SAGE, or the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. Leave it to those of us in Washington to come up with a boring way to describe absolutely the most exciting concept, the idea of taking information in motion about missiles and planes moving around and fusing that with referential databases, information at rest that contain, the features of the Earth and the location of facilities, and being able to track bombers and planes and missiles moving in real time over digital information representing the United States and use that to manage what might be a battle over the United States, that was a concept that existed only theoretically, but not practically until the late 50s and early 60s. The unification of information at rest and information in motion created the modern the modern integrated computer network that today is the principal, is or was until recently the principal inhabitant of cyberspace. And that is what caused the United States in particular to look at cyberspace as a domain, not just for the use of moving things around and telling people we move the battleship here, we move the tank there, but actually a place where warfare could be conducted. Have we actually seen a cyber war? Probably not yet, in that we haven't gone to war with a country and engaged in combat in cyberspace and cut off diplomatic relations and restricted travel and interred their foreign residents in the United States. We haven't done any of that yet. But on the other hand, we are beginning to see the exercise of force in cyberspace, even if it isn't always attributed. Countries like North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, and perhaps the United States too, are now engaging in things in a concept called persistent engagement, and that's to go out and be on somebody else's network and disrupt their ability to be on your network. Now, a moment ago, Gary, I said that these integrated computer networks, including the cell phone, the smartphone into which I saw you speak a few minutes ago, and the computers on which we're both working right now, and the networks that support them were the things that inhabited cyberspace. But there has been a recent change. If one takes a look at the world today, it's not the computers that inhabit cyberspace, it's us, it's human beings. We also live in cyberspace. There are about 7.5 billion, 7.6 billion people on this planet. Over 4 billion of them, more than 50%, have access to cyberspace. China has over 800 million people online. We have about 327 million people in the United States.
Wow.
In other words, there are more people online in China than there are people in the United States. So increasingly, there are those who believe that cyberspace is not inhabited by integrated computers, it's inhabited by human beings. And that leads to what has happened, which is while we regard cyberspace as an electromagnetic domain, China looks principally now at cyberspace as a place where human behavior is governed, just like it is governed on the straits of Guangzhou or Beijing. And that means that in time, we may look at cyberspace as sovereign territory that can be contested in warfare. Has that happened yet? There are signs that it could happen, but I don't know that it's happened yet. What keeps me awake at night? What keeps me awake at night is that we depend on cyberspace for our business infrastructure, our critical infrastructure, our national security, and our economic security. But this is a cyberspace that is increasingly dominated by a global network that we may not control, over which we don't have decisive influence. And if other countries think of cyberspace as sovereign territory, they may try to establish sovereignty over the cyberspace that is ours, or on which, that is not ours, but on which we depend for our banks, for our financial systems, for our healthcare. And that leads me to the other thing that keeps me awake at night, as it were, and that is that cyberspace is now so valuable, and the information in cyberspace is so valuable, that attempts to control it, to undermine it, to undermine the integrity of data in it, to hold it at ransom have ramped up. That's bad enough when they're holding at ransom your account for which you pay for your television subscription. But it's far worse if your data is encrypted and you're being made to pay a ransom to get that data back. It's for a hospital IT system that you need to manage patients, or as happened recently, a company in the UK that does clinical trials for new vaccines. So the fact that cyberspace is now a human domain, the fact that the information in cyberspace is so valuable, and the fact that so many systems have proved vulnerable, particularly to ransomware, those things worry me a great deal. Your question, which sector is the most vulnerable? That is a hard question to answer, in that increasingly more and more sectors are interconnected. We're going to use global 5G networks. Those networks allow for the swift direct connection of information of IoT or Internet of Things devices. IP version 6 is making a virtually unlimited number of internet addresses available for those devices to use. At the same time, um, the use of artificial intelligence will make us want to collect data from these devices, to analyze that data, and use that data to manage medical infrastructures, road infrastructures, energy infrastructures, healthcare infrastructures, any infrastructure you want. So I would say that if vulnerabilities are emerging, it emerges throughout any business sector. Now, having said that, the stakes of a problem of any vulnerability in the healthcare sector are greater, perhaps now, than they've ever been. We are relying on the integrity of data for testing, for tracking and tracing cases, for clinical trials when they start to occur, as some already have. The integrity of that information is absolutely vital. We won't manage the COVID-19 crisis if we don't have confidence in that data, or that data has been stolen or undermined or changed or encrypted. The other issue is that we're going to have to deploy a lot more healthcare systems more quickly. We may be building more hospitals, more clinics, many more IoT devices, infusion pumps, ventilators, other computer-driven things that are connected on the one hand to human beings, and on the other hand to the hospital's IT system, and hence to the internet, are going to be deployed. Many of those devices were developed not necessarily with security in mind. They weren't developed carelessly, but this wasn't their first function. And we want to be able to deploy them rapidly with what are called flat networks, without having to go through too much difficulty in their interconnection, so that they can be up and running. Being able to impose compensating security, that is, security that it will compensate for the lack of intrinsic security, is one of the things that we really need to do. And if we don't do it, we won't master this crisis nearly as quickly as we need to. And as I said, we've already seen some troubling signs. So while I wouldn't say that the medical field is less secure or more vulnerable than others, I would say that the immediate stakes are very high.
Yeah, life and death. And as sort of a bizarre coincidence in our world, I happen to have just finished our latest edition of our comic, and it's called Defending Your Health. And it was all about real life stories, of this character that was injured, and he's in the ambulance, and they're taking his personal medical information on an iPad, and all our little creatures are crawling around it, seeing how they could steal it. Then he's admitted to the hospital, and then in the ER, and all the creatures, Ivan the ID thief, Wilbur WannaCry, Boris the bug, Phoebe the fisher, are all lurking around these digital medical devices, searching for vulnerabilities. And this was done before COVID-19. So, it was an incredible, a coincidence. What do you recommend? How do you create a culture of cyber awareness, or if I can use, commonly used word, cyber hygiene, within the healthcare ecosystem? Because so many of the hacks are caused by simple human error.
Well, there are at least two things that one has to do, and they're both important. Neither are easy. Neither, however, are impossible. One has to do with lessening the likelihood of mistakes by creating an information technology architecture that doesn't create opportunities for mistakes, that ensures that before you gain access to medical records, there is dual factor authentication of some kind, or some way of ensuring that you are the person you are supposed to be, and you have access only to the things to which you are supposed to have access. And there are good architectures available today. There are lots of good approaches for data integrity. You can back systems up and make sure that if your system is held at ransom, that you have access to your data. There are good guidelines that have been published by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology and the Department of Health and Human Services that show how products available today can be used for better identity management, better access management, better backups. So part of this is making sure that the architecture is good. The other part is up to us as human beings, and that is we should not cut corners. We should make sure that yes, in fact, we did not leave the word password in as the default, password on a new device. That when we configure a server or when we configure an infusion pump or some other medical device, that in fact that there is a policy at the hospital, at the clinic, to manage passwords and manage interconnection, and that we do not ignore it.
And how is Mitre working to enhance cybersecurity for other organizations, Sam?
Well, we're doing rather a lot. Different parts of Mitre are working with different parts of the nation's national and homeland security community. Let me describe a few things that we're doing that I think are making a fundamental difference. In the center for which I am the director, the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center, we're working on the cybersecurity of devices, of medical devices that are connected to human beings on the one hand and the hospital's IT system on the other. Working on the cybersecurity of telehealth. So particularly now as people are being diagnosed and getting some treatments at a distance using information technology, making that secure. Working on the cybersecurity of patient records and patient imagery, MRIs and X-rays. We've done a great deal of work recently on the cybersecurity, on data integrity, which is making sure that if you of improving your defenses against ransomware and your ability to recover from it. Looking at the cybersecurity of systems that use artificial intelligence. Mitre at a broader level has worked on a program called ATT&CK, which allows us to characterize adversarial techniques and technologies and to say, this is what we're seeing, this is probably who the adversary is, and this is what they're going to do to your network, so this is how you need to defend yourself against this particular adversary. That's something that we have been doing, of which we've been working very hard. Mitre has been working on a program called Squint, which in essence is the cyber version of See Something, Say Something, to be able to look at social media. And if you see something in social media that looks suspect or peculiar, to be able to capture it with a screenshot and send it to an analytic engine at Mitre that looks at possible attribution and other aspects of it and tells you that this is probably true or probably not. We developed this in working for election security, where we're doing a lot of work, including the security of voter registration systems, which if they were undermined could cause chaos in election. But Squint, however, is we're also doing it now, making it available to the medical community, because there is disinformation out there. As I said, it was developed, Gary, in large part for election security, so that if you saw on your phone, hey, you don't need to vote at this voting place, they're going to close it down, but if you vote here, you could vote there, and it turns out you couldn't vote there.
Right.
Or, hey, people over 60 don't vote today, you can vote tomorrow. Well, that may not be, probably not true. This allows you to get an instant readout of potential disinformation. And as we know, there is disinformation that's been spread about COVID-19, and to be able to detect that and to be able to bring that to the awareness of decision makers and municipal and other authorities, and state authorities and national authorities, so that they can do something about it, is incredibly important. We've also put in place a thing called the National Election Security Laboratory, where the companies that make voting equipment can come in and quietly and privately work out, identify if there are issues associated with the security of voting systems, and work to mitigate them in a protected environment. Mitre is also looking at the cybersecurity of national security systems. We're working with the government to improve the cybersecurity of federal government agencies. And my own center is working on the cybersecurity of financial systems, energy systems, healthcare systems, AI systems, and systems for retail, systems for hospitality, systems now starting to work on the cybersecurity of connected vehicles. So the breadth of MITRE's cybersecurity activities and the contributions we make, I think, is pretty impressive.
Well, I mean, I had no idea, and I had a general idea of what MITRE did, and I'm sure our audience is just learning a great deal about this. One of the interesting things that you just brought up that caught my attention is this notion of disinformation and this convergence of the digital and the kinetic world. So we see this now manifesting itself in the attribution of 5G networks being a causation for the COVID virus. How do you handle that?
Well, first things first, you handle it with the truth. That that particular piece of disinformation is untrue at every level. And the allegation that it's untrue, the allegation itself is untrue and provably untrue. In part, people have tried to make the allegation that 5G lowers the ability of immune systems to resist COVID-19. There's no evidence of that. And oh, by the way, they've made that claim in places where 5G has yet to be deployed. So that makes it particularly specious, if not silly. What to do about it? Two things. First, if that is detected, it should be brought to the attention of competent authorities, and those authorities should make clear what the truth of the situation is. And secondly, Gary, public education about science, public education about technology, public education about medicine. I think we have been perhaps too long in this country and perhaps elsewhere very narrowly focused on our own interests, and we take for granted that other people are taking care of this and that it isn't necessarily our responsibility to be as well informed as we should be. Being informed citizens means being informed broadly, looking at many sources and asking about how authoritative a source is. What is the attribution? If you read something online, where did it come from? Why do you believe it to be true? Or are you operating in a social ecosystem, in an echo chamber in which the same piece of bad information echoes back and forth? You think it's coming from 100 different people, but it's actually being parroted by 100 different people. It's one bad piece of information. That people should become more discriminating, that they should learn to differentiate based on attribution, based on the breadth of education and knowledge, I think increasingly is a public responsibility, and one that we in the public bear both collectively and as individuals. I think when I go back to my father and I say he was a superhero, for leading the family at his time and coming through the war and having a brother lost in the war and working on the project and raising a family and being able to send us to college, he also instilled in us that it was our responsibility to be informed and questioning and critical citizens that our democracy depends on. There is no magic, there is no silver bullet to fixing this. This is something we all have to do. And if we don't take responsibility for it, if we only listen to the sources that agree with us, we will limit the scope of information that we make available to ourselves only to the things that we want to hear. And that is not the sign of a healthy democracy. And we, as the world's leading democracy, we need to be sure that we strengthen at every step our ability to be the most well-informed people that we can.
So speaking of, kind of well-informed as it pertains to cybersecurity, one of the things that I thought was pretty amazing is this notion of you being a repository of CVEs. Can you explain to our audience a little bit about, CVEs and how they work?
The best answer to that question, Gary, would be that there are people at MITRE who actually work on the CVE project.
What is it?
I'm not one.
What does it stand for?
But the common vulnerability database and environment, CVE, is a way of understanding and normalizing information about vulnerabilities so that they can be used broadly, so that people throughout the country in various industries and throughout the government have a common way of understanding system vulnerabilities, that there's a common language to describe them, a common set of data that can be accessed and used such that people don't understand this in different ways. We are increasingly using a broad set of the same technologies throughout the country and our industries. The ability to characterize the vulnerabilities associated with those technologies, and this is important, to manage the integrity of that information such that we know where it came from, we know that it's good, the configuration of the information about that vulnerability is stable, that it hasn't, that it isn't, that it's unquestionably good, that its own data integrity. That's what the CVE program does. It provides a stable way to describe the vulnerabilities that we all in our various systems need to address.
So
And that,
what happens when, let's say a threat researcher reports, a CVE, and it goes through, the screening and the protocol. What is their responsibility to report back to the, let's say a company that this vulnerability was identified in? How does that work? Do they welcome the news? Hey, it's great that, someone found this vulnerability, I'd like to fix it, or do they, sort of try to sweep it under the table and say there's nothing wrong with our stuff?
I would say that there increasingly in this country, people are prepared to take responsibility for vulnerability. And fundamentally, there are two groups of people who need to do it. There are the companies whose equipment whose equipment or software may have those vulnerabilities. These are the hardware and software manufacturers, whose products comprise the cyber ecosystem on which we depend. But there are also the companies, those of us who own and operate those networks. Either they're the telecommunications carriers or the cloud service providers or the end users. All of us have collective responsibility. In general, the companies that make these products, when they are aware of these vulnerabilities, and many of them do a lot of their own independent testing, they're pretty forthright about them. The real question is whether or not we're in a position to mitigate these vulnerabilities. And in case after case, we've seen over the years that patches are available, but people are reluctant to take offline a production system to patch a system. We have old people who are still operating outmoded operating systems. A friend of mine is operating an outmoded system, and he said, why should he upgrade? And I said, well, did you notice that they've sent you a notice that they've told you that they no longer support that operating system? That doesn't mean it doesn't stop working. It means that they're not going to be looking for vulnerabilities in it anymore, and they're not going to be pushing patches down to you to fix it. So, you have a responsibility to upgrade your operating system to one that is being supported. And support includes accepting and installing the patches and security updates that are made available. So this is a responsibility that has to be accepted by end users, by service providers, and by the product manufacturers. What I would say is that increasingly there are good mechanisms for information sharing. The information sharing and analysis organizations, the ISAOs, and the information sharing and analysis councils, the ISACs. I'm on the board of the new Space ISAC, looking at the cybersecurity, particularly of commercial space systems. Wow. They're working very hard. The first thing we did upon standing the thing up, coming up with a logo and a name, and making sure that we actually had members, was to put in place an information sharing working group. That information sharing working group's its principal function is to share information about vulnerabilities and ways to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And we have found increasingly that there is an appetite. There's another issue here, and that is that cybersecurity has tended to be expensive and difficult. And it's one thing if you are trying to secure, a very sensitive national security system, and it's not that cost is no object, but depending on its importance to the security of the nation, one will spend what one has to. But a business, cybersecurity may be their top priority, along with paying their employees. Turns out that's important. And billing their customers, that's important. And paying their suppliers, that's important. And conducting research and development for product for new products, that's development, and having a go-to-market strategy and being able to deal with competitors. All of those things are important. Compliance with whatever standards are important in that industry, that's important. So one of the things that needs to be done, Gary, is it's important to start bending the cost curve of cybersecurity such that while people know it's important, it's also practical and affordable for them to have it. That's something in which I have a very strong personal interest. I've led several cybersecurity businesses before coming to Mitre, before making the decision that I wanted to work only in the public interest. And that one of the things that I believe, based on having managed some cybersecurity businesses in the private sector, is we want to make it as affordable and practical as possible. People want to have good cybersecurity, but they want to have their business survive, and they want to be able to compete, and they want to serve their customers. This is a country of great entrepreneurs. And as a country of great entrepreneurs, we want to be able to do everything well that makes our business viable. We've seen an insatiable appetite for good cybersecurity, but when I say insatiable, it gets sated pretty quickly if it can't be if it's unaffordable. And that's something.
Well, I mean, I had heard recently, excuse the interruption, on that point, I had heard recently that there was a study done that an enterprise might have, 75 or 100 or more solutions in their cybersecurity stack. Is that true?
Cybersecurity stacks can be very complicated, ranging from firewalls to endpoint protection, to the use of heuristics to be able to detect anomalous behavior, to the use of artificial intelligence to be able to determine if your network is behaving in a way that it shouldn't, to data loss, to protection systems, to intrusion detection and intrusion prevention capabilities, to security information and event management systems, also known as sort of a dashboard into which all this data flows and to which one does correlation. Maybe not necessarily 75 to 100, but maybe several tens of these things.
Yeah.
And making sure that they work and that they're interoperable and that they can be kept up to date and that they're used to instrument an enterprise network is a complicated job. And getting more complicated as networks become more interconnected and an enterprise no longer owns its own network. One of the things that our center, on which our center works, is the development of what are called reference architectures, or examples of how to put these products together in a way that actually represents a way of doing it right. Just as 100 years ago, you might have explained, these are the products necessary to put together a steel mill and a blast furnace to make steel of a certain caliber for bridges or ships or buildings. We specialize in the development of reference architectures, ways of taking commercially available technologies and putting them together such that they're interoperable and effective for the nation's business infrastructure. So yes, there are a lot of technologies. If one goes out to something like the RSA conference, you'll meet hundreds, if not thousands of companies, large and small, including some fascinating startups that are working on every aspect of cybersecurity. One of my concerns, Gary, is this. I think we need to unify in our country research and development on cybersecurity with research and development on information technology. For too many years have we deployed information technology and then deployed security solutions a few years later as we catch up. We need to make cybersecurity science, research and development a component of and lock it into the same development life cycle as information technology and computer science technology and development. Those are things that I think ought to be done. This calls for, in my view, the need for a national whole of nation cybersecurity research and development strategy that allows it to catch up and synchronize with the development of new information technology. We're going to have 5G networks globally in a few years, not immediately, but you can see it coming. We're going to have people talk about as many as 1 million IoT devices per square kilometer. I don't know if that number is correct, but one could see it, right? There are 1 times 2 to the 128 128th number of potential Internet Protocol 6 addresses available. So you could have that many devices. We're going to use AI to collect this data and use it to manage road and policing and other infrastructures. SpaceX is talking about putting as many as 12,000 satellites overhead for global 5G coverage. We're going to need to learn how to secure this new global cyber ecosystem. And so one of the things I would say is that research and development into cybersecurity needs to catch up and connect itself into research and development for information technology. And one of the things that's beginning to happen is we are seeing some of this in 5G. Groups like the 3G PP, which is the working group developing 5G standards and technology, are spending a lot of time looking at how to secure the various stacks, the various slices within 5G environments on which we're going to depend. So so industry itself is beginning to heed the call. Nonetheless, I think at a national level, a national research and development strategy for cybersecurity that includes government, academia, nonprofits, and the private sector, which is where the bulk of the R&D money is going to get spent anyway. I think it's something that is certainly timely and for which I would push as hard as possible.
Well, speaking of timely, I could go on forever. Can you spend a few more minutes, or do you want to go take care of Norman the hound dog?
I have another few minutes, but then I need to, and then Gary, I do have another commitment this afternoon.
Okay, I mean, this is just terrific. Thanks so much, Sam. So, we're talking all about defense and everything you just described. Can you share with us kind of a recent blinded, cyber attack somewhere in the world that's caught your attention? What happened? What were the consequences? And most importantly, what were the lessons learned?
Well, there have been several incidents. Some, I think, are profoundly disturbing. A hospital chain in the United States that had to stop admitting patients at 3 hospitals because ransomware locked up their IT systems and made the admissions of patients impossible. I think that's profoundly disturbing. In the case to which I pointed earlier of a company in the UK that does clinical trials for new vaccines, and the owner of that company said he'd rather shut the firm than pay the ransom, and they're recovering from it. And there have been ransomware attacks against several cities and municipalities in the United States. So already you can see that there could be a disruption to public life, as there certainly was in Atlanta and then in Baltimore, because of ransomware, and potentially a disruption to public health. However, the NotPetya attack a couple of years ago that took place and started in the Ukraine, I think, is illustrative. This was an attempt attributed to to another major country to infect the Ukraine's software in the Ukraine used by that government for tax reporting. And therefore, if you're a company in the Ukraine and you pay taxes, or you're operating in the Ukraine and pay taxes, you use this software. And if the software was infected, you'd be infected. Well, among the companies that was infected was Maersk, which is the world's largest shipping company. Right. And that meant that their entire infrastructure was infected. So it is reported. And that in turn meant that systems around the world to which Maersk was connected were infected. This is a way of seeing how a cyber incident, in this case a cyber attack, not an exploit to steal information, but an attack to actually make the functioning of a system not work properly, can proliferate and go perhaps well beyond control. There are a number of interpretations as the motivation to demonstrate that this effect is possible, that another country can do this, that we have to take this into account, I think is a possibility. Leaving that aside, the amount of interconnection from a foreign power to another country's tax collection system, to a global shipping company, to the global shipping industry around the world, based on this, that is a staggering amount of damage that was caused, and it certainly cost billions of dollars. So that to me was illustrative. And should a company have been more prepared? Well, in the end, when you take software from your government for the collection of taxes, there may be a reasonable expectation that it has had, that it has gone through software security testing and that it isn't necessarily the subject of another major country's efforts at cyber exploitation and attack, and that they may not have that vulnerabilities. The attack on the Ukraine's power system, the dark energy attack, which took place a few years ago, I saw a video shot by one of the operators of the Ukrainian power grid as he watched through his computer the network that he manipulates taken out of his control and manipulated and shut down while he was powerless to do anything about it, watching from the same computer terminal at which he should exercise command and control.
Wow.
Are doing a pretty good job in our country of building defenses against that. But again, it gives you a sense of what might happen if you don't expect it. Now, if another country does that to us, conceivably there would be consequences. And one thing I would do is I point your readers to the recommendations of the National Bipartisan Cybersecurity Solarium Commission out of Congress, led by Senator Angus King and Congressman Mike Gallagher, which made a number of recommendations to improve the cybersecurity of this country. And in closing, I would say that those recommendations bear our attention. And I think those recommendations are, in large part, a roadmap to improving not only the cybersecurity of our industry and our business infrastructure and our critical infrastructure, but also improving the overall cybersecurity capabilities of the nation and making clear to other countries and to cyber criminals that we are strengthening our defenses and that there will be consequences, and there will be consequences. So that's my last comment, Gary, unless you have any other questions.
Well, you're just terrific, Sam, and let me end by the way I began, by thanking you for being a real life, unsung cyberhero in this world. How does our audience get more information about some of the great stuff that Mitre's doing?
Well, there are several places to go. The best would be to go to mitre.org and search on the word cybersecurity. Our own center is, if you search on Mitre and then NCF, that stands for the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center, or NCF. And Mike Murphy can send you the exact link to that, would be a good place to do it. One of the questions I anticipated you asking, and I'll answer it even if you don't, is who's my personal superhero?
Well, wait, hold on. I was going to ask that, but I wanted to make sure that this did not sound like a commercial because, I do the Cyberhero Adventures, Defenders of the Digital Universe, and I didn't want to upset a guy of your stature, So, but who is your favorite superhero and why?
Well, I'm going to give you an unexpected answer. I actually met my superhero, and I got to know him personally, and over a number of years. And there is a statue that depicts my superhero, and he's not a character from your world necessarily. His name was Jan Karski, Jan, Jan Karski. Jan Karski was a superhero in the most realistic sense of the world. He was a young man born of a Polish noble family who, during the Second World War, went into the Polish underground. He became a courier in the Polish underground between the Polish underground in Poland and Poland's government in exile in overseas. He went into a Nazi concentration camp and into the Warsaw Ghetto and saw what the Nazis were doing to the Jews and came back out and escaped Poland and brought that to the Allies and met with President Roosevelt in the White House. He stayed in the United States, and I had the privilege of studying with him at Georgetown University. There is a statue of him at Georgetown University sitting in a bench with a chessboard. Jan Karski was, of course, always well-dressed, always in a tie, always with a pocket square, always immaculate, always modest, rarely talked about his role in the war, but a man who actually broke into and out of a Nazi concentration camp and escaped to the West with the story of what the Nazis were doing. I regard that as a real superhero.
Wow. On that note, thank you so much for what you and your team do. And if you don't mind, would you be my mentor, please?
Gary, let me close by saying the real heroes today are not people like me who have the luxury of sitting behind their desks. The real heroes are the people who are making things happen. They are on the front lines of this emergency. They are doctors, they're nurses, they're
Yes.
janitors, they're people who are keeping the power on, they're people who are keeping those facilities clean. There are people in public service who are picking up the refuse that we generate, the people on whom we all actually rely. One of my colleagues, his wife is a doctor. She comes in every day. She takes off her clothes in the house mudroom. The clothes go into a washing machine on a sterilized cycle. She has to shower and then change into fresh clothes before she can greet her family.
Wow.
Believe me, she didn't sign up for that. But I can tell you this, that makes her a hero. So, enough about, unsung heroes like us, the people we need to be celebrating and the people on whom we rely, and they're not letting us down. They are doing us proud, and there's not enough thanks we can give them.
God bless them all. Stay safe, stay home. Thanks to Sam Visner.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for your attention and letting me join you today, Gary. It's been a privilege.
Me too.